Okay, welcome everybody. Our last session of the day and of speakers and some really great programming because there's a lot of exciting things to talk about in terms of the Colorado reintroduction and then some things that we can talk about with Mexican gray wolves and red wolves. We will start with the Colorado reintroduction, but let me do a quick introduction of all the speakers. We have Gary Skiba from the San Juan Citizens Alliance representing Colorado, and John Murtaugh from Defenders of Wildlife also representing Colorado, and then Emily Wren of the Grand Canyon Wolf Recovery Project, and Aaron Hunt from lobosofthesouthwest to talk about Mexican gray wolves, and we've had some interesting updates there. And then, of course, the red wolf. Welcome, Reagan Downey from the Wolf Conservation Center. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to start with Colorado because Gary has so kindly got us in his schedule today and he needs to leave fairly shortly. So let's start, let's kick it off with Gary and John.
Okay, you want me to start off, John?
Yeah, why don't you take it away? And
or you want to? Okay. Yeah. Well, as most of you know, Colorado passed a ballot initiative this fall to require Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the state wildlife agency, to reintroduce wolves to Colorado. They're required to do that by the end of 2023. And what I'm going to talk about is some of the groups that have been involved in the process overall, and a little bit about legislation that has happened this current legislative session and where that stands. And John's going to talk about some of the other pieces of what has gone on over the last year and a half, 2 years on wolf restoration. So the Colorado Wolf Coalition is what we are now calling the project. It used to be called the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, and there were some things going on with just nonprofit management requirements that ended up, we renamed the coalition that we have. So the coalition is pretty much a loosely managed. Oh, I am so sorry. I'll continue talking, but I have to go do something in the kitchen. I'll be right back. So I'm going to continue to talk. And I am so sorry about that. I put some water on for tea and forgot about it. So I'm back. And the coalition is composed of a number of entities, both organizations and individuals. And just some of the organizations are Blue Sphere Media, the Center for Biological Diversity, the Denver Zoo, Defenders of Wildlife has been involved. The organization I work for, the San Juan Citizens Alliance, University of Colorado at Denver, the Western Environmental Law Center, Western Watershed. So it's pretty much the regular kind of cast of characters that you would expect to see in this group. And so, as I said, it's been a fairly loose coalition. There is no real structure to it. It's not a 501c3. It's just a coalition that meets on a regular basis and coordinates the efforts of the groups to try to just focus on what's going on now. And so what's happening recently is that, and John's going to talk more about this, I believe, is Colorado Parks and Wildlife has started a planning process to figure out how they're going to develop a plan to restore wolves to Colorado. And so that's really kind of where a lot of the action is right now. More recently, there have been a few things that have popped up with, in fact, just in the last week, a couple of counties in Colorado have passed resolutions to prevent the reintroduction of wolves in their counties, which frankly, they have no legal standing to do, but they've done anyway. They've passed the resolutions, which are really, as I say, have no legal teeth to them, but they do want to make a political statement, so they will be doing that. And that is going to make it more difficult for CPW. If they identify the best place to reintroduce wolves as being somewhere in a county that has passed one of these resolutions, they'll approach it more gingerly than if that wasn't the case. So I don't know how they're going to deal with that, but it is sort of a complicating factor in what's going on, even though it's not, as I said, it has no legal standing, but it is going to make it more difficult for the agency. So those are just kind of some of the background things and where we're at. What we're doing with the coalition at this point is we're establishing a series of work groups to focus on different areas. And right now we have 3 active work groups, one that is based on earned media, which is letters to the editor, op-eds, that kind of thing, and opposition research, which is just kind of maintaining some contact with the organizations that are opposed to wolf restoration. And there's some ugly history there, but at any rate, they're still out there and they're still somewhat organized. So we're keeping tabs on them. And again, just making statements to, letters to the editor and other avenues that we have that we can try to establish a better contact with the public and get them to better understand what's going on with wolf restoration. So there's that group. There's a communications group, which is more broadly includes things like social media, education efforts outside of things like letters to the editor and that sort of thing. And then we have a coexistence group, which is focused on the techniques to have wolves and people get along better. And we have a number of individuals that are associated with the Wolf Coalition that have a broad experience with these coexistence techniques, working on them in Montana and other parts of the Northern Rockies, and some other individuals who've worked in the Mexican wolf area as well. So those folks, those are the kind of three main working groups that we have that are going to continue to function and hopefully get even more functional. We're trying to get them off the ground. It's been a little slow because we had kind of a changeover when after the election. I mean, up to the election, everybody was focused on one thing, which was to get voters out and get them to support Proposition 114. So that's what they did. And we were successful in the end, barely, but we were successful. It was a very small percentage win, which was frankly surprising because all of the polling that had been done showed much broader support than what we saw in the end in the actual vote. So anyway, we did win, and but that was kind of, in a way, it was a major success and major hurdle that we'd gotten over. But then it was sort of a letdown in a way. It was because it was kind of like, well, now what do we do? And so that's where we've sort of reformulated the coalition and moved forward and started to focus more on the CPW planning process and the other things that we can do in order to get the public more aware of what's going on and to keep the pressure on CPW to get this done. There's some concern about the speed at which they're doing it, but we're doing what we can to make things move as quickly as we can, but as effectively in the sense of making sure that all of the individuals and stakeholders that have an interest in wolf restoration in Colorado are actually their needs are met, or at least their needs are recognized, and at least they have a chance to make those needs known. So that's kind of where we are with the coalition itself and where that's going. The other thing that I wanted to talk about briefly is the legislation that was introduced this year. And there were three different bills introduced to the Colorado legislature, 2 in the House and 1 in the Senate. The Senate bill was one that focused on the process that CPW would use and tried to direct the agency in very minute detail as far as how the process would work. One example is they said, you're going to have these public meetings, which are required by the proposition itself. So there's no question they're going to be public meetings. But this bill in the Senate required that there be 60 days between any 2 meetings. So if you had one meeting, and it could be in Northwest Colorado, you couldn't have another meeting, say in Southwest Colorado, until 60 days later. And there was no real purpose to that other than to slow down the process. And that has been the major tactic of the opposition, is to try to slow things down as much as possible, because there's some potential for federal action with relisting, which would make it more difficult for Colorado to acquire and reintroduce wolves. So that's one of that's really the strategy that's involved there, is to slow things down. And that was part of the reason for that one. So that bill failed in committee. We are fortunate in Colorado right now that we have Democratic control of all of the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. So bills that are being generated, they are primarily from the Republican side that are anti-wolf. And those bills are failing in committee. They're never making it out of committee to the full chamber. So that's what happened with the Senate bill. The other House bill was House Bill 1037. And I'm trying to remember the details of that bill. It had, John, help me out here. What was the, get me started and I'll remember.
It said you can't reintroduce a wolf into a county that didn't vote for it, or if CPW has spent money recovering a species in that county, i.e. everything, elk, deer, moose.
Right. Yeah, because the way it was written, I mean, CPW has spent money in every county, probably in every municipality, on things like restoring deer and elk. And the way this bill was written, it said you can't do it in any of those places. And in fact, it wouldn't have allowed wolf restoration anywhere in Colorado the way it was written. And it was such a silly bill that it failed immediately in committee as well. So those two bills are gone. But it gives you a flavor for what the opposition to the restoration of wolves, kind of what they're thinking. And it also ties into that, what I mentioned earlier, the county resolutions that are out there right now, where the counties are trying to tell the state what it can do as far as managing wildlife, which again, they have no authority to do. So there were those two bills. The third bill was another House bill. It was House Bill 1040. That bill had a requirement. The focus of it was to not spend revenues that were generated from hunting or fishing licenses on the restoration of wolves in Colorado. There are a lot of hunters who are opposed to wolf restoration. There are hunters who are not as well. But there are a number of hunters who are opposed, and the more vocal ones are the ones that are in opposition, of course. And so that was the focus of it. And the bill had some problems with it, the way it was written. It wasn't very clear as far as which funding sources could or couldn't be used for wolf restoration. So that bill was postponed, which basically means it was killed, but was given late bill status, which means they could bring it back in another form. So they did. And that bill, the revised version, was just released today. And that version is much more clear in where the funding can come from. And it also, as the original bill did, says that there will be funding from the state legislature. So wolf advocates are on board with supporting that bill because CPW has plenty of money to use to restore wolves outside of the money they generate from license revenues. There are things that they get $20 million every year in lottery funds. There's an excise tax on oil and gas that's used for species conservation work. There's a federal state wildlife grants program. So there's plenty of funding out there, over $22 million every year. And the expectation is that wolf restoration is going to cost about $500,000 a year. So it's 2% of what they have in funds for non-game or threatened endangered wildlife. So there's no question they have the money to do it. And so outside of hunting revenue, so it's not a concern. And the real advantage of the bill is that it says the legislature will allocate funding for wolf restoration. So that's pretty much what I had, and I can answer some questions now only because I have to leave right at 5:30. I've got another meeting. So if anybody has a question for me now, I'd be happy to take it. And I apologize for being cramped that way, but that's the way it is. So, and then John can take it and talk about the rest of the things.
Oh, Gary, you just went on that mute on the last bit. Does anyone have any quick questions for Gary? It looks like one's come through. What do you think was the most beneficial in Colorado's success?
I'm not sure I really know that, other than the fact that most people really do like wolves and want to see them restored. And that's just the way, as I said, at one point, some of the polling that was done early showed an 84% support for wolf restoration in Colorado. And as I said, the election itself, it was less than 1% difference in the pro and con in the election. So we don't know what happened there and what changed people's minds. Some people who like wolves, who wanted to see wolves, did not vote for the restoration because they were concerned about the fate of those wolves that came into Colorado. So there's definitely a component of the public that was concerned about that and didn't want wolves restored for that reason. So I don't know what it is, but there's no question the main thing that made it go, we did the best we could to educate people and to give them good reasons to vote for it, but what really made the difference is people like wolves.
Yeah. Well, that's heartening to hear. I know you need to go, Gary, and there's another question, but John, I think you can probably pick this up when we get to the Q&A as well. So Gary, thank you so much for fitting us into a very busy schedule. We really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you, Betsy. Thanks for our organization. Sorry I couldn't hang out more, but really got to do this other thing. So thanks, everyone. Take care. And if you have other questions, my email address is there somewhere. Feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to answer if I can. Okay. Take care, everyone. Bye.
John, do you have any final comments on the Colorado reintroduction?
Yeah, I'll try to just make some quick as I can. Little additions there. And first of all, I think it was Connie in there just to echo, yes, yay, Colorado. I love being able to talk about Colorado right now because it seems like it's one of the few bright spots with all that's been going on. But we are in a really good position here where we're reintroducing wolves. It's a law now that's in statute in Colorado. It's going to happen, and we have no reason for this not to be the most well-informed and well-executed reintroduction of wolves that's taken place, given that we have all this experience to draw on. I just really quickly to get to some questions that I may be anticipating. Why Colorado? Why did we do this in this way? One, particularly Colorado is very important for connectivity of wolves from the high Arctic down to Mexico. We have our Mexican gray wolf population in the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Mexico. And of course, populations of gray wolves throughout the Rockies. But Colorado is that missing piece to really create that connectivity we want to see and reestablish that corridor. And as Gary said, wolves have been popular in Colorado for a really long time. But why reintroduce wolves if wolves have made their way west to Oregon, Washington, California? Well, that comes down to two basic reasons. One, we are probably all painfully aware that about 85% of the state of Wyoming, wolves can be killed without limit whatsoever, absolutely no rules. And it requires passing through what's known as the Red Desert, which is just less than favorable habitat for wolves in southern Wyoming. So we've had a few wolves trickle into Colorado over the past 20 years or so, but we have never had documented reproduction in the state and nothing to lead us to believe that we could create a population on transient wolves. Meanwhile, Colorado has a little known law that actually makes it illegal for the Parks and Wildlife Agency to reintroduce a listed species. That decision has to come from the legislature. In our case, we decided, well, we'll skip the General Assembly and we'll do it through a ballot. Either way, it makes it into statute, but that is part of the requirement for why this had to be a ballot. Colorado Parks and Wildlife, no matter if they wanted to and they had all the best intentions, all the best information, they simply couldn't do this without the approval of the state. So that's just a little extra context for why we did it through a reintroduction specifically. And then I'll just really quickly add, if you are in Colorado and you think you might make a good voice for a stakeholder advisory group, applications end at the end of the month. So on the 31st will be the last day. The state is putting together a stakeholder advisory group, which will be somewhat typical stakeholder group, though we're hoping it's fairly inclusive, and a technical work group that will look at the actual logistics for reintroduction. That technical work group would include state and federal agents and academics, ideally people with some real professional wolf experience. Okay, I think I was maybe as quick as I can make it. I'll close it off there.
Thank you so much, John. Would you do me a favor? Do you have a link to those where people can apply? Could you drop that in the chat or okay?
Yeah, I'll go dig that and I'll drop it in the chat.
Thank you so much. We'll move on to Emily and Aaron now for Mexican gray wolves. It's a perfect segue after our Colorado conversation. I'll let you guys take it from here.
Thanks. This is Emily in Flagstaff, Arizona, and I'm just going to start with a little bit of background information on Mexican wolves and the Mexican wolf program, and then I'll hand it over to Aaron to talk more about how to take action. So I know today we've been talking a lot about northern gray wolves so far. So for those of you who might be a little less familiar with the Mexican gray wolf, it is a genetically unique, smaller subspecies of the northern gray wolf. So it's Canis lupus bailey is the scientific name. They are a smaller wolf, so they tend to be about 50 to 80 pounds in size. And we also refer to them as lobos, as their Spanish name. For Mexican wolves, you'll always see some tan or buff coloration in their coat. So unlike most of the photos we see from Yellowstone National Park, those wolves can be all black or mostly gray. Wolves, we always see some buff coloration in Mexican gray wolves' coat. They are native species to the American Southwest and Mexico, but were wiped out in the early 20th century by humans, of course. A repeated story for wolves everywhere. And here in the Southwest, their preferred habitat is really the higher elevation montane forests of the Southwest with abundant prey and water. So you might be visualizing someplace like in the canyon or, saguaros in Arizona, but really Mexican gray wolves do prefer elevations that are typically above 5,000 feet, where there's an abundance of primarily elk is their preferred prey in the American Southwest. All Mexican wolves alive today are the descendants of just 7 individual wolves that remained by the 1980s, excuse me. So those 7 individual wolves became the founders of the captive breeding program that saved the species from extinction. So that when we talk about this genetic situation coming from such limited founder individuals, that's why we often consider Mexican gray wolves one of the most endangered mammal species in the world. They are protected under the Endangered Species Act currently. So I know we've talked a lot about the national delisting of gray wolves across the lower 48 today, but Mexican gray wolves are actually exempt from that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decision. So they are currently listed as their own entity as a unique subspecies under the Endangered Species Act. And then they're given a special status, which is called the 10J experimental non-essential reintroduced population. So that is in one of the handouts that we shared with you. There's some like common terms and definitions, and one of those handouts also explains a little bit more about the 10J population status that they have. They were first reintroduced back into the wild in 1998. So I think that's important to think about in your mind when you think about the Northern Rockies. Were reintroduced just a few years before Mexican wolves. So we're now in our 23rd year of the reintroduction effort, and the current population of Mexican wolves in the wild is 186 individuals. And that's in the US population in eastern Arizona and western New Mexico. So 186 Mexican wolves are now found in the wild at the end of 2020. That included 20 breeding pairs that had pups that survived to the end of the year. There's currently 46 known packs and some individual single wolves that consist of 17 packs in Arizona, 29 packs in New Mexico. Of the population right now, there's about 96 wolves that have satellite collars. So these are GPS tracking collars that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is using to track and manage the population in the wild. That's about half the population we have in the U.S. And last year, there were 20 captive born pups that were cross-fostered into the wild packs. And this is the only release technique that is currently being allowed by both the state game commissions in Arizona and New Mexico. So they're currently blocking all adult releases and pack releases from the captive breeding program into the wild, and only allowing this cross-foster technique of pups to be reintroduced into wild dens right now. And that's the only opportunity to try and increase the genetic diversity of the wild population. So I'm just going to mention briefly a few of the current threats to the Mexican wolf population in the wild. Like I mentioned before, they do have this very limited genetic diversity in the wild population. So some geneticists consider them to be as closely related as siblings right now in the wild. Not that they're actually breeding with physical siblings, but that they are that closely related. And so even though it's a great thing that the wild population is growing, and 186 wolves is actually the highest the population has ever been since the reintroduction started, again, it's more of the same genetics are kind of continuing to grow with only some of these cross-fostered pups hopefully making it into the wild population and surviving to breeding age themselves. We also have threats that are ongoing with the artificial boundaries that have been placed on this population. So that includes the Interstate 40 boundary, which is the northern limit of the Mexican wolf reintroduction area right now. So unlike my project's actual name, Grand Canyon Wolf Recovery Project, implies we don't actually have Mexican wolves today allowed to exist in the Grand Canyon region. So if any wolves cross I-40 to the north, they'll currently be captured and removed and either taken into captivity or moved back into the current recovery area. We also have the US-Mexico border wall, which places a boundary on the southern limit for Mexican wolves and prevents any kind of dispersal between the US and Mexico, where there's a very small reintroduction of Mexican wolves in Mexico as well, about 35 individuals or so. Illegal killings have been a huge concern for Mexican wolves over the years. We know there have been at least 105 documented illegal killings from 1998 to 2019, which is the last reported year that we know about. There were 29 Mexican wolf mortalities in 2020, but we have not heard the causes of all those mortalities yet to date. And then finally, I just wanted to mention management removals are a huge concern for Mexican wolves. There have been at least 221 documented management removals of Mexican wolves since the reintroduction began. So most of those are for livestock, perceived livestock conflicts. At least 104 of those occurred for that issue. And then another 51 wolves have been removed for boundary issues. So wolves are just dispersing like they're known to do and crossing those arbitrary lines and get removed. So that management removal is actually a higher number than both illegal killings as well as even the initial releases of wolves from the captive population into the wild. So that's also a big concern. This is definitely unfortunately a very heavy-handed species in terms of its management over the years. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erin, and she's going to talk a little bit more about some of those policies and how you can get involved. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. Erin Hunt here from Lobos of the Southwest, working primarily in Arizona and New Mexico, but speaking to you today from San Diego, California, the land of the Kumeyaay. I'm very happy to be here with all of the amazing panelists. So as Emily said, we have had some heavy-handed management of Mexican gray wolves since reintroductions began in 1998, but we do have an opportunity to change that management for the better. This year, we are anticipating an additional public comment opportunity on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's 2015 Mexican gray wolf 10J management rule. So we've provided some resources that go into all the acronyms and what is a management rule, what is 10J, what is an essential or a non-essential experimental population. So feel free to look through that for more details. But in short, this is an important rule that governs management in the wild. And a court found that the existing 10J management rule violates the Endangered Species Act and fails to conserve the endangered Mexican gray wolf. So it does not follow the best available science that we know will guide the path to recovery for these rare wolves. In 2020, the conservation community rallied and generated over 87,000 comments, mostly supporting changes that would rely on independent academic science rather than political pressure. There are going to be some additional opportunities in 2021 to provide comment, and we're just waiting for the dates of the public comment period. It may be this summer or possibly early fall. So we're asking you to check MexicanWolves.org for updates on when you can comment. We do want to stress that the science-based management rule will designate Mexican gray wolves as essential, giving them full protection under the law. It will lead to a distribution and a population size that achieves ecological effectiveness. So that means enough wolves in enough places that will allow Mexican gray wolves to play their natural role as top predators. It will address the genetic crisis that Mexican gray wolves face, and will include measurable standards for assuring progress towards recovery benchmarks. A 10-day management rule based on science will support the release of bonded wolf families into the wild, taking into account the highly social nature of wolves. It will limit human-caused mortality, and it will include firm requirements to prevent conflicts with livestock and support non-lethal resolution of conflicts. Science tells us that we need at least 750 to 1,000 Mexican gray wolves in several populations. We need 3 in the United States and 1 in Mexico. Mexican gray wolves need areas like the Grand Canyon ecoregion and the Southern Rockies, in addition to the areas where they can be found today. We have an opportunity to tell the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to follow the science and eliminate the existing population cap, which is set at 320, and we can remove or revise the northern boundary that's currently marked at Interstate 40. Wolves are a wide-ranging species and they need freedom from boundaries. We can't keep removing wolves from the wild because they roamed beyond a geographic boundary into an area north of Interstate 40. We also have to address the recent increase of wild Mexican gray wolves being removed from the wild or killed in the wild. We need to make sure that the management rule states that wolves will not be removed from the wild for predation on wildlife such as elk or deer. These are native prey for Mexican gray wolves, so they need to be able to live with their prey species and take advantage of native prey. We also need to make sure that there's authorization for government or private individuals to kill wolves that is restricted to only extreme cases where wolves may pose a threat to human health or safety, which science tells us is very, very rare. So there needs to be far more restrictions on when Mexican gray wolves can be removed from the wild or killed. We want to address the fact that Mexican gray wolves are being removed from the wild in high numbers because of preying on livestock. This is often happening on public lands and often in areas where cattle are unattended. So there hasn't been a good faith effort to try to prevent that conflict from occurring. The majority of people in Arizona and New Mexico support conserving endangered Mexican gray wolves, and we're asking you to join our pack and let us hear you howl. And you don't need to live in these states to participate. This is a federal comment process and anyone can participate. We hadn't included this in your information packet, but we do have word that there is an opportunity to speak out on an issue in New Mexico, but you don't have to live in the state of New Mexico to participate in this. There is a law or a bill, New Mexico Senate Bill 32, otherwise known as Roxy's Law, that would ban recreational trapping on public lands in the state of New Mexico. So we heard some talk earlier today about trapping and how harmful that can be to wildlife populations, as well as human safety and the safety of people's pets if you're out hiking with your dog. So bills that ban recreational trapping are pretty important for the safety of people, the safety of their pets, and our native wildlife populations. Mexican gray wolves are impacted by trapping in the state of New Mexico. So this also helps protect endangered species like the Mexican gray wolf. I'm going to drop a link into our chat, and maybe this can be shared with the email later, but there is an opportunity to contact the governor of New Mexico to express support for safe public lands and wildlife conservation. So that link will give you more information and more resources if you would like to get involved in that. If you live in the state of New Mexico, this is particularly powerful to encourage the governor to lead by example and make New Mexico an example for other states. You can also make that same statement if you're coming from out of state. So again, you do not have to be in New Mexico to participate. If you travel to New Mexico, if you want to take advantage of the beautiful and amazing and unique outdoor recreation opportunities that New Mexico has to offer, this bill represents your values and your interests too. So you absolutely have the right to speak out and to contact the governor and say that you want New Mexico's public lands to be safe and wildlife friendly. So we'll make sure you get that link. You can also check mexicanwolves.org for additional opportunities to speak out and support our work. We have a volunteer opportunity that's kind of an immediate opportunity to get involved. It's a citizen science project called Track the Packs. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service historically has provided information about the wild population of Mexican gray wolves on a monthly basis. But in 2020, the service transitioned to quarterly updates. And that means it may be months or more before we find out about important events that impact the recovery of these rare southwestern wolves. From exciting news like a cross-fostered pup surviving to tragic losses like wolves disappearing or being killed, this is information that the public needs to know to continue ensuring that these endangered wolves are getting the protection they need to survive and thrive. So if you're looking for an ongoing volunteer opportunity that will help us get more frequent updates on individual wolves and packs in the wild, we've got a job for you. You can help us track the packs by monitoring known wolf locations using a publicly available map, contacting me if you see anything that you have a question about or see anything unusual, and helping us call the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service once a month to get an update on your assigned wolves. You don't have to worry. We'll help with training and with information about what questions to ask each time you call. It'll also help us by sharing what you learn, helping raise awareness about Mexican gray wolves and what they're doing in the wild. We will email or have a phone call if you need additional information and you want to get involved. I can set that up with you at any time. And as a public agency, we want to make sure that everyone is aware that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a responsibility to provide information in a timely manner. And you can help ensure government transparency and accountability as we advocate for the return of Mexican gray wolves to the wildlands of the Southwest. So you can email us at info@mexicanwolves.org if you would like to get more information about that or if you want to sign up to volunteer. If you can't commit to an ongoing volunteer task, you can absolutely still help. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can follow us on social media at Mexican Gray Wolves on Facebook and Twitter, or at Friends of Lobos on Instagram to help you stay informed about Mexican gray wolf conservation. You can check out our action toolkit on mexicanwolves.org for tips on writing letters to the editor and other ways to speak out on behalf of wolves. In your participant packets, we've provided additional resources to help you participate in state game commission meetings in Arizona and New Mexico, engage with elected officials, and participate in public comment periods like the upcoming 10J management rule comment period. You can donate to support the conservation efforts of all the amazing organizations that you've been hearing from all day. Grand Canyon Wolf Recovery Project is GCWRP.org, or my organization Lobos of the Southwest is mexicanwolves.org. You can find out more information there. And most importantly, do not give up hope that you can make a difference. Whoever and wherever you are, your voice is powerful. Don't be afraid to use it.
Thank you so much, Erin. If you wouldn't mind, we've gotten a couple of requests for the tracking opportunity, if you want to put a link into the chat for that. And up next, Reagan, you're going to take us home by talking about the wonderful red wolf and their status today. So,
great, thank you. Is it okay? I have a few slides to share. Is it okay if I share my screen?
Should be able to.
Okay. I just wanted to check just before sharing. But red wolves are sometimes so little is known about them. So I find for some people it can be nice to see some visual components. So can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Regan Downey. I'm the Director of Education at the Wolf Conservation Center. We're located in South Salem, New York, and we work to protect and preserve wolves in North America through science-based education programming, participation in recovery programs and release programs for endangered red wolves and Mexican gray wolves. And then we also work to protect wolves through advocacy efforts. Specifically, today I'll be speaking about our work to recover red wolves. As a recovery organization for red wolves, we do house and care for 15 red wolves on our property. We also, as an aside, have 21 Mexican gray wolves that live at our center as well. And the goal of both of these efforts is to release those wolves into the wild to allow them to resume their rightful place on the wild landscape. Red wolves are facing a lot of challenges right now, and unfortunately, they've been facing challenges for the last several decades and several centuries. So very briefly tonight, I will go over the history of red wolves, recovery efforts, and their current status, but also current challenges and ways for you to help. So in terms of the history of red wolves are a distinct species of wolf. I know we've been focusing a lot on gray wolves today, and then just now focused on Mexican gray wolves. And red wolves are a separate species altogether, and they are quite unique in their appearance. So this is one of our red wolves who lives on site at our center. His name is Jack, and he is a really great example of what a red wolf looks like. So average weight about 45 to 80 pounds, kind of mid-size between a coyote and a gray wolf in terms of body weight. You'll notice some reddish coloring along their ears, their back, and down towards their tail. Just like gray wolves, red wolves are a social animal and do live in family groups. They're also most active at dawn and dusk, just like gray wolves, but they are a bit kind of shorter in stature as well. Red wolves historically were found all across the Southeast, ranging from Texas to Florida, all the way up to actually right about where our organization is in southern New York. But just as gray wolves were pushed to the brink of extinction through overhunting and habitat loss, the same happened with red wolves. And so their population shrunk quite drastically. And today in the US, there are only 10 known to remain in the wild. Now, these 10 are given protections. They are listed as an endangered species, but similar to Mexican gray wolves, where they live in the wild in North Carolina, they are classified as a non-essential experimental population. So the recovery efforts for the red wolf have been quite targeted with the goal of originally just building up the population and saving them from extinction. And then in 1987, we started actually releasing red wolves into the wild. So this recovery program for red wolves actually began decades ago, as red wolves were declared an endangered species in the 1970s. Efforts began to capture the last remaining red wolves that could be found in the wild. And scientists believed they found the last few living in the Gulf Coast region of Texas and Louisiana. They brought those red wolves into captivity, and 14 red wolves became the founders of the captive breeding program at the Point Defiance Zoo and Aquarium in Washington State. Today, red wolves still belong to a captive program. It's what's known as a species survival plan, and roughly over 40 organizations across the United States work to care for red wolves in captivity. But again, the ultimate goal is growing the population in captivity and also releasing wolves into the wild. The Wolf Conservation Center firmly believes that if there's a place in the wild for wolves, they should not be living in captivity. So with red wolves, wild releases began in 1987. They were the first example or first wolf species that was actually reintroduced to the wild. So the Yellowstone release was modeled off of red wolves, and then we of course know with Mexican gray wolves and Colorado eventually. So red wolves kind of served as the original model for releases into the wild. And then, as was mentioned briefly just now, and then with Emily and Aaron as well, the wild population in North Carolina is classified as non-essential experimental. We do advocate for a change in status to essential, just as with Mexican gray wolves, to give them more protections. So this map, we did discuss historic range. You'll see the source population of wolves that were taken out of the wild decades ago to begin the captive breeding program. But specifically, we're going to look at where red wolves live today, which is North Carolina, specifically a 5-county area. And most of the red wolves are found on the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, highlighted in green, or the neighboring Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. When these reintroductions began in 1987, the Fish and Wildlife Service actually held captive-born red wolves in what are called acclimation pens within the wild territory to allow them time to acclimate to the wild area They were then fitted with radio collars and released after a few months into the recovery area. And their population has since grown, but they have also experienced some challenges and some setbacks. So if we look at this population graph, we see the population starts to grow quite drastically, spanning from 1987 to 1993, when 42 red wolves were released over those years into North Carolina. The population continued to grow in the early 2000s, and there was also an exciting boost as in 2002, the Fish and Wildlife Service began a process known as cross-fostering, which is when captive-born wolf pups are placed with wild litters, and those wild wolf families will essentially adopt and raise those pups as their own. Just as was mentioned with Mexican gray wolves, it is a good way of improving genetics by introducing captive genetics into the population. But of course, cross-fosters are not the only way to release wolves, and they are certainly not a substitution for releasing family groups and bonded pairs. We then saw the population peak at about in 2006 at about 150 wolves. But then that is also when we started to, unfortunately, years later, notice a decline in the population, primarily due to management actions on the part of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the State Wildlife Agency in North Carolina, which is known as the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. So 2011 to 2012, there was a spate of illegal killings that caused the population to decline. And there wasn't a lot of support on the federal or state level, which, as we know with Mexican wolves as well, and just with general delisting of gray wolves, a lack of support from the overseeing agencies can oftentimes result in an increase in poaching. In 2013, the Wildlife Resources Commission authorized coyote hunting in the recovery area. As we saw from our picture of Jack the red wolf, red wolves are very similar in appearance to coyotes. So an increase in coyote hunting oftentimes results in an increase in red wolves killed due to mistaken identity. In 2014, Fish and Wildlife Service actually decided they were going to conduct a review of the red wolf program per North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission's request, and they actually stopped all adaptive management actions for their program, which meant they stopped releasing red wolves into the wild, and they also, very importantly, stopped sterilizing coyotes. One of the threats to red wolf recovery is hybridization with coyotes, and to prevent this, the Fish and Wildlife Service was sterilizing coyotes and then placing them back into the wild. Those sterile animals would then serve as placeholders and prevent any newcomers, new coyotes, from staking a claim and potentially breeding with red wolves. But they stopped doing that in 2014, which did lead to some hybridization, thus threatening the recovery program. Despite all of this, despite the lack of support from federal and state agencies, a majority of North Carolina residents do support red wolf recovery. An independent poll in 2016 revealed that 73% of residents do support red wolves and do want to see them recovered in the state. Last year, 2020, saw the population drop to its lowest level since releases began in 1987, and we did actually see Fish and Wildlife take kind of one step in the right direction when they released a male red wolf into the recovery area. So there is a propagation island off the coast of Florida. It's known as St. Vincent National Wildlife Refuge, and it's essentially an area for captive-born red wolves to live kind of wild because it's an island, but they are then hopefully released into the North Carolina recovery area. And so in 2020, wildlife officials did move a red wolf male from St. Vincent to an acclimation pen in North Carolina, where he was paired with a wild-born female, in the hopes that they would form a strong enough bond that when released into the wild together, they would not only stay together, but would hopefully welcome pups in the spring. They unfortunately did not stay together after being released, and so they did not welcome pups. And that was the second year in a row that no pups had been born in the wild. As we're all aware, it's quite obvious. No pups born in the wild, no releases from captivity, and illegal killings makes it very hard for a population to grow. However, we did also recently see the Fish and Wildlife Service release 2 additional red wolves from St. Vincent's just last month. Unfortunately, one of the wolves released was hit by a car and did pass away shortly after release from the acclimation pens. But the second male that was released has been reported to be staying roughly in the same area as the wild-born female that he was placed in the acclimation pen with. The 2 pictures on the left, the top picture is the red wolf male from 2020 who was released into the recovery area. The bottom is the wild female he was released with. You'll notice they both have orange tracking collars. In an effort to cut down on accidental killing of red wolves due to mistaken identity, the Fish and Wildlife Service has been slowly fitting more red wolves with bright orange collars. Any coyotes that are collared are given black collars. So they are trying to distinguish them just a bit from those coyotes. So current status of red wolves, it's at the lowest, one of the lowest numbers it's been since recovery efforts began. There are currently 10 known to remain in the wild. That does count that surviving St. Vincent male from just last month. But we do still face challenges. So as discussed, the Fish and Wildlife Service began a review of the recovery program in 2014. And then in 2015, they suspended reintroductions of captive-born red wolves into the wild. In 2016, the Fish and Wildlife Service proposed a new rule that would call for shrinking the recovery area and giving red wolves essentially fewer protected areas in which to roam. Also in 2016, Judge Terrence Boyle issued a preliminary injunction to stop Fish and Wildlife Service from killing wild red wolves. The service had been killing red wolves that strayed onto private property, and also in a few public cases gave private landowners permission to kill red wolves on their property as well. In 2018, the Fish and Wildlife Service proposed a new 10-J rule to shrink the recovery area, limit the number of wild red wolves that could live in that recovery area to just 15, and once again allow killing of red wolves off of federal lands. So any red wolves on private or state lands could be killed. Not surprisingly, a court found the Fish and Wildlife Service was violating the Endangered Species Act in doing this, and they issued a permanent injunction to stop the service from killing red wolves. This past November, Fish and Wildlife Service was once again charged with violating the ESA for failing to further red wolf recovery, and a judge did order that the Fish and Wildlife Service had to come up with a plan by March 1st to release wolves into the wild this year. The Fish and Wildlife Service responded, and they said they would attempt to cross-foster pups. That, of course, is a bit of an open-ended promise because captive-born pups need to be born at the same time, roughly, that wild-born pups are born. And so far, we don't actually know if there are any known breeding pairs in the wild. So we could potentially see pups cross-fostered. They would be cross-fostered presumably in April or early May. And conservation groups that filed the lawsuit are actually asking for an additional 6 wolves to be released for a total of 8 wolves this year. And the Fish and Wildlife Service is once again pushing back. So that, unfortunately, is in the hands of the courts. So there's not much in terms of public actions that can be taken right now. But there is developing kind of research going on about red wolves. There is research currently going on in Texas and Louisiana to identify possible red wolf ancestry in Gulf Coast canids. The Wolf Conservation Center is currently one of the funders of this research. The Fish and Wildlife Service is currently updating their red wolf recovery plan that was last finalized in 1990, and they have a kind of a finish date of 2023. As mentioned, there could be releases this year as soon as next month, but hopefully definitely by the end of the year as well, taking from the captive population, releasing wolves potentially in the summer when there's no hunting seasons. But as mentioned, recovery is in the hands of the courts. So in terms of ways the public can take action, as is true with all wolf populations, regardless of status or state where they're found, it's really important to show your support publicly. So whether it's just raising awareness with friends and family so they are aware of red wolves, Red wolves are quite elusive where they're living in North Carolina, and even many people that live in North Carolina are often unaware that they're sharing a state with a critically endangered animal. So it's important to raise awareness for red wolves. It's also very important to oppose any measures, especially congressional measures that would weaken the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act is the only reason we have red wolves, Mexican gray wolves, and gray wolves today. And it is very important to continue to fund the ESA and to continue to keep it very strong, so not weakening any measures of that. Again, teaching family and friends, but also expanding your knowledge. A lot of organizations host free webinars for the public to learn about red wolves. The Wolf Conservation Center itself does offer a series of scientific webinars for free to engage the public with scientists that are doing kind of on-the-ground research. And then we do have a QR code for anyone who might like to visit our Save the Wolves page to learn more. You can scan that with the camera on your smartphone, but that link is also included in your handout as well. But with that, I do have my email up. If anyone does have any really in-depth questions that they are not comfortable asking right now, or would prefer to ask after doing additional research, feel free to copy down my email or our website to stay in contact moving forward. With that, I will stop sharing so I can yield back.
Thank you, Regan. We've gotten some questions coming through, and I'm now scrolling back to try to see where they started because there's so many comments flying through here. I did want to bring up one to John, actually. I found it rather fascinating that even though the voters approved the reintroduction of wolves into Colorado, there apparently seems to be all kinds of efforts to thwart that initiative. So in a way, it reminded me of our conversations earlier today where we could all breathe a sigh of relief if gray wolves were relisted, but not necessarily. And in this instance, we really shouldn't be breathing a sigh of relief that this is going to be an easy initiative or an accepted, well accepted or supported initiative. Do I interpret that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I think to a degree, yes, right. I mean, we always need to be vigilant about attacks, and it's when we go to sleep that people sneak in, all this stuff. You stop paying attention; they're crafty. Having said that, the commission has made it clear several times that they're not interested in relitigating the results of the election. So at least the agency and the commission seem committed to carrying this out, but there are certainly those out there who would like to, throw up some roadblocks and delay or look for some technicalities to basically render it obsolete. So, I'd say I am proceeding with cautious optimism because I have heard good talking points at least. But I think we all know, we've all been jaded enough maybe that you don't want to just take people at their word. You want to see the results too.
Yeah, seasoned, we can say.
Yes.
Great, thank you, John. Regan, here was a question for you. We have heard that the Fish and Wildlife Service was looking at Western Louisiana and Arkansas as potential habitat for reintroduction. Is there any updates on that?
No, so there's no updates. And quite frankly, I think it's very important for the Fish and Wildlife Service to really refocus efforts on the existing population of wild wolves. In order for a population to thrive and be self-sustaining in the wild, as Aaron mentioned, with Mexican gray wolves in particular, you do need several locations, and it would be quite foolish to allow one effort to die out in North Carolina and then try to initiate the same effort in another state. The work has been done in North Carolina. Work still needs to be done, especially with some local landowners in the community. So while they are potentially identifying additional release sites, there has been no concrete information coming forward about that. I should also note the Fish and Wildlife Service, in an effort to be more transparent in this process, they have been hosting quarterly what they call partner calls with organizations that work in North Carolina, and the meeting minutes are public record. The Red Wolf Coalition does post those on their website. So the public, while they're not able to join the calls, you are able to see what is discussed. So that could certainly be a good resource for individuals as well. I will see if I can find the link and post it in the chat.
Great, thank you very much. And we have a comment for Emily and Aaron, and I hope I pronounced this correctly. First, they say thank you for your long years of work for Mexican gray wolves. Kaibab and Kanab, habitat viability question mark, or can you also report on any indigenous support? I'm pretty sure I didn't say that correctly. Aaron or Emily, would one of you like to take that?
I did try and answer that a little bit in some of the later chat. So I posted a document that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service prepared as part of the Mexican wolf recovery plan on tribal perspectives on Mexican wolves. So it's kind of a broad overview of tribal perspectives. And then currently only the White Mountain Apache tribe is an active member with the Mexican wolf reintroduction program, and they do have their own biologists. They keep information about their packs of wolves on tribal land proprietary, so that's not made public. And then, so that's about that. And then there have been a number of feasibility studies that have been done looking at the Grand Canyon region, comparing habitat for Mexican wolves over the years, really going back over the last 15, 20 years. Scientists have identified suitable habitat north of I-40 that would be really important for Mexican wolf recovery, for things like climate change, social conditions on the ground, public lands, things like that are all really important for wolf habitat. And so there is suitable wolf habitat north of the Grand Canyon on the Kaibab Plateau as well. We know that wolves were there historically, and there was actually a northern gray wolf that dispersed from the Yellowstone area in 2014 that made it all the way to the North Rim on her own. She was named Echo by school kids. And then she was there and actually seen by many people traveling into the park on the North Rim for a period of time. And she unfortunately didn't find a mate. She didn't settle there, and she traveled north back into Utah and was shot and killed by a coyote hunter. But I mean, we don't think there would be a lot of packs, necessarily inhabiting the North Rim. But it definitely would help to have initial reintroductions at some point in the future to get them going on the North Rim if we're ever going to see Mexican wolves established in that part of the region. So I hope I answered that question, but I'll go back and take a look at it and see if I think of anything else. Yeah, we do have some links to a number of scientific studies on our website as well.
Great, okay, wonderful. Aaron, did you want to make comments or?
Yeah, just adding to what Emily said, another Grand Canyon Wolf Recovery Project resource that I had dropped into the chat is a map and a document that talks about places for wolves. It was actually prepared by Defenders of Wildlife based in the Southwest region. So that is a pretty helpful resource for where Mexican gray wolves are and where they could be someday.
Good, great, thank you so much.